Macros, the make or break of your performance. This is probably the one thing that you do not want to get wrong with your nutrition. Watch on, because I'm going to tell you exactly why and exactly how you can use macronutrients to your advantage. Yes, my people, my name is Sam Gerlin and I'm the founder of Gerlin Nutrition. I'm a fully qualified nutritionist and coach who is looking to help people reach their health and fitness goals using nutrition and a holistic health approach to get there. Today we are talking about macros. And what are macros? Now, at face value, simply put, they are the nutrients that we need in our diet in larger quantities. Okay, so the macronutrients are, as you may probably already know, protein, fat, and carbohydrates. But how should we be splitting these macronutrients up in our diet? What ratio should we be having them in? What quantities? Especially if we're performing on a daily basis, we're very active, we've got goals in fitness and health to strive for. What's the best way to split them to optimize and to improve? Okay, so we'll get straight into it without any further ado. If you see me looking here, as always, it's because I've got my laptop. I want to make sure I'm covering all the points and providing as much value as possible. I'm going to clear my throat real quick. Let's get into this. So we'll start with protein. Now, protein, as many of us know, is so important for building and repairing muscles. It's integral macro for muscle health. It also supports immune function. It's also involved in the production of enzymes and hormone health. So it's a really integral macronutrient. Now, for every 1 gram of protein, there are 4 calories. So that's something that I wanted to give note to. For carbohydrates, it's the same. It's 4 calories. But for fats, it's double that and a little bit more. It's 9 calories per gram of fats. Sources of protein include, obviously, your meats, your beef, your steak, your chicken, your turkey, all those sorts of things. Your fish, of course, salmon, tuna, mackerel, oily fish there. You've got things like sea bass. They're all categorized as protein. You've, of course, got eggs, dairy, and then you've got your legumes. So your beans, your pulses, lentils, these sorts of things. You've got tofu and tempeh, of course, which are more vegan-based sources, soy, these sorts of things. And you've also got your protein powders as well, okay? Now, my recommendation for protein, we'll get into this in a little bit more detail very, very soon, is 1 gram per pound of body weight. So just getting that on the table from the get-go for protein, you're looking at 1 gram per 1 pound of body weight. So if you're a 150-pound athlete, you guessed it, that's 150 grams of protein. Okay, moving on to carbohydrates. Now, this is your body's main fuel source. It's your body's main source of fuel. So especially during higher intensity workouts where we're entering, anaerobic zones, so without oxygen, carbohydrates are going to be integral. Now, again, just to reiterate, that's 4 calories per 1 gram of carbohydrate, and some sources include your fruits, bananas, oranges, apples. I don't have to list those out. Your vegetables, again, I don't have to provide examples, but also your whole grains, your rices, your pastas, your breads, oats, things like beans as well. So there's a lot of crossover between things like beans with protein and carbohydrates, and then things like for performance, sports drinks, gels, chews, these sorts of things, okay? A little tip on carbohydrates: the more active you are, the more intense your workouts are, the higher volume you're putting in, the more carbohydrates you're going to need. It's a pretty simple equation in that respect. Moving on to fats, the third of our 3 macronutrients. Now, as I mentioned, there's 9 calories per 1 gram of fats. And they're so integral for, hormone production, things like brain health. They're also help absorb fat-soluble vitamins. So, vitamin A, vitamin D, vitamin E, and vitamin K. They're the fat soluble, I believe. So involved in so many different functions in the body. Some sources include nuts, seeds. They're 2 of my go-tos. Things like extra virgin olive oil, fatty fish, avocado, eggs. Again, there's crossover between protein and fats on eggs. I won't dive too deep into the difference between saturated and unsaturated fats. That's not really the purpose of this video, but there's more content to come surrounding things like that. So you can expect some content real soon on, what's a monounsaturated fat, what's a polyunsaturated fat. So make sure you subscribe and stay tuned for that sort of content coming real soon. But again, a little tip on fats is that they're so important for recovery. So whilst of course protein and carbohydrates are important, their involvement with hormonal balance is so important, and we'll talk about why that is and how you can incorporate fats into your diet in a moment. Okay, so with all of that covered, I want to get into the real crux of the video, which is, how can you split your macros to perform and recover optimally? Now, this is going to look very different between one person and the next. It's also going to depend on how much you train, the volume that you're putting in, the frequency, so how many days you're training per week, how many times you're training per day, and of course the intensity, so how intense are those sessions. It also depends on the weight of the athlete, which is often dictated by, not always, but by sex, by gender, whether you're male or whether you're female. But to dive into, a training day versus a rest day, because I assume you're watching this video, because you're interested in, if you're on my channel, it's likely because you're either interested in nutrition, you've got a health or a fitness goal, or, you're working towards whether it's a marathon, a half marathon, a high rocks, whatever it may be. So we're going to start this conversation off looking at a training day against a rest day. Okay, what's the best way for you to split this up to optimize your performance and again your recovery? Okay, so for someone who's training, let's say 60 to 90 minutes on a training day, so that might be split into 2 sessions, or you might be doing that just in 1 session. That could be an endurance activity, which is of low intensity. It could be an endurance activity of higher intensity. You could be lifting weights, whatever it may be. But let's just assume for now that it's moderate to high intensity. We'll start with protein, which is pretty much standardized across everyone. Now, again, a recommendation, going back to the start of this video, is 1 gram per 1 pound of body weight. That is a really easy metric to remember. If you're particularly active, you can look at increasing that, but as a bare minimum, 1 gram per 1 pound of body weight. So again, if you weigh 150 pounds, that's 150 grams of protein per day. We can talk about some ways, to get that in a moment, but just remember that for now. Moving on to carbohydrates. Now, for those moderate to high intensity days, so that's where you're looking at your heart rate, entering higher end of zone 3, zone 4, and perhaps a little bit in that VO2 max zone 5 zone. You're looking at 3 to 5 grams per kilogram of carbohydrates per day. So I've got to do my maths now, but let's say that you weigh, again, to use the same example, or no, we'll use a different example. Say you weigh 75 kilograms, that's me as an athlete. If you're on a moderate to high intensity day, you're going to want to be taking on at least 225 grams of carbohydrates. Probably, the more intense, the more carbohydrates you're taking. So you might look at 4 grams up to 5 grams. So that might be bumped up to 300 grams on that day, even 375. Okay, so this is where it becomes iterative in nature, and you've got to work it out as you go, and that'll become more obvious the more you train and the more you fuel. You can sort of tap into the way you feel on certain days and really realize and then start to actualize, how much carbohydrates you're taking on a daily basis. On a moderate to high intensity day, that's where we want to keep our fats nice and low, because there's no real need to be eating too many fats because they're slightly more calorific. Remember that there's 9 calories per gram of fats, so we can keep them on the lower end. So that might be 60 to 80 grams. Again, this is all relative. I'm throwing out some numbers here. I'm using myself as a reference point. I'm 75 to 80 kilograms typically, tends to fluctuate around that zone, just for reference. But this will be relative to one's body weight and one's age, one's physical activity once again. So this is really highlighting the true nuance of nutrition and how much difference there can be from one athlete to the next. But yeah, the key takeaway here is to keep fats low, or at least on the low to moderate end on those higher intensity days. So effectively, the more carbohydrates are needed on the higher intensity days. We can keep fats nice and low on those days. And the reason being is that, you know, we need to replenish what we put out. So, you know, our glycogen is our stored glucose, our stored carbohydrates. And if we've not got any, you know, blood glucose in the system, we draw from those stores in our muscle and in our liver to fuel our performance. So the idea being, we want to keep those carbohydrates nice and high, to keep those glycogen levels nice and high, to ensure that we're showing up for training, whether it's a second session later in the day or indeed the next day. So we're recovering and keeping on top of things. It's really about being proactive with things like this. Okay, so now on a rest day, this is where things can change ever so slightly. So this might be an active rest day, so just a lower intensity day. You might be going out to get some steps in, or you might be going for a light jog or a light spin on the bike, 60-minute cycle, keeping it in those lower zone 1, zone 2 zones. So it's very much aerobic. You're using oxygen. So that means whilst using oxygen, if you're well fat adapted, you're going to be using stored fats as your primary fuel source. So on these days, this is where we can really get clever with it and up our fat intake, lower our carbohydrate intake ever so slightly, so that we're getting that benefit from eating those healthy fats. So as we mentioned, that's really important for hormone balance. So, you know, getting the right balance of, for us blokes and females, testosterone balance, these sorts of things that are so important, managing cortisol levels. Fats are going to be really important for that. They're obviously really important for brain health as well. So getting those healthy fats in on the days where we're less reliant on carbohydrates is really important. Protein will stay the same. That is a consistent variable that is standardized whether you're resting or whether you're, you know, particularly active on one day. You can, to get into the weeds a little bit, you can increase it on those more active days, but it's not wholly necessary. I just thought I'd, you know, mention that, but yeah. So the takeaway from this section of the video is that on your active days, keep the carbohydrates nice and high. And on your rest days or your less active days, less intense days, you can up the fats ever so slightly. Cool. Let's get into the next section of the video, which is, you know, I've already sort of alluded to it here, but it's just being flexible with things. Now, often it's quite easy to sink into the routine of eating the same things every day. I've been there myself. It's easy. You wake up, you have the same breakfast. You might have meal prep for the week, so you've got the same lunch every day, and you might have done the same for dinner, okay? You're eating the same snacks in between. But what can be helpful is looking at nutrition in a week block as opposed to a daily block, okay? So, you know, yes, your fats might be lower on one day, higher on the next. Carbohydrates might be higher on one day, lower on the next. But it's how that standardizes and how that maps out across the week, which can be more important and easier to sort of measure that way, because naturally, if your fats are higher, likelihood is your calories might be slightly higher. You can adjust for these sorts of things, because if you're not active on one day, you might purposefully take your total calories down anyway. But if they are slightly higher because you've eaten more fats on a rest day, what you want to think about is how that maps out across the week. So a good way to do this is if you do calculate your maintenance calories. Again, I'm not a big calorie counter. I don't think it's, you know, the most conducive to a healthy relationship with food, and then indeed making the whole process enjoyable. But if you do calculate your maintenance calories and use it as a tool as opposed to something that you rely on, and then multiply that by 7, so you've got the week, and see what your total calories are for the week. That can be a helpful little indicator just to keep on top of things, and you can do the exact same for your macros. Okay, so if you know that you need 1 gram per pound of body weight per day, you can multiply that by 7, see how much protein you need for the week. As an example, you do the same for carbs, you do the same for fats. Okay, now a few little tips, you know, because if you're an elite athlete, you know, and I don't think this is the audience that I'm necessarily appealing to here, you know, no offense, I'm by no means an elite athlete myself. These guys are on a different pedestal, you know, they're dedicating their lives to this. So they've got all day to think about what they're going to eat, all these sorts of things. People like us, you know, mere human beings, we've got to work, okay? So how can we fit this sort of structure around a busy lifestyle? So some tips for, you know, the everyday athlete, you know, who's working and then trying to squeeze training in at lunchtime or after work. on top of their meals, a really helpful tool is just to use some meal prep. Okay, so I'm a big fan of meal prep. I won't go into too much details here, but some options you might consider are perhaps you cook up 3 lunches or 4 lunches on a Sunday so that you've got lunch standardized for the first 4 days of the week. You can cook up enough the evening before for lunch the next day. You can even sort of tamper with the carbohydrate and fat sources ahead of time to again adjust for training and rest days. And that's really about being proactive with things. So it's maybe on Sunday reflecting, okay, how's my training week going to look? And then planning backwards from there. So for example, if you know that Tuesday is a rest day for you, Monday night, you cook up your dinner, but you have the majority of the carbohydrates on the Monday night post-session, and then you have slightly less carbohydrates the next day, and you might chuck half an avocado into that meal prep. Just as an example, okay? Another really important point is to stay on top of this. What I want you to think about doing is really loading your carbohydrates around your training. So that's pre, during, and after. So especially during those intense sessions, it's so important to stay on top of carbohydrates, as I've mentioned. But the best way to do this is to take on carbohydrates beforehand. So if it's a really intense session, you're looking at around 2 grams per kilogram of body weight. So again, using myself as an example, if I'm a 75 kilogram athlete, I'm looking for, you know, around 150 grams in the 4 hours leading up to that session. So that's quite a broad time horizon. If it's, you know, you're training in the morning, for example, you've not got a lot of time, aim for 50 grams. 50 grams of carbohydrates. That can be done with 2 bananas. That can be done with a banana, a bit of toast and some honey. That can be done with a carb mix and a banana. You get the point. So if you're training in the evening, aim for 150 grams. So that's 2 grams per kilogram of body weight, using me as the reference point again. In the 4 hours preceding, if you're training early in the morning, you've only got an hour before you train, aim for 50 grams of carbs. That's a good number to sort of strive for. Okay, and then it's really important on top of that, if it's a long session, to take some carbs on during. So I'm always encouraging practicing race day fueling strategies. So taking on intra-workout carbs in the form of a gel, in the form of chews, in the form of drinks. And then you can emulate that strategy on race day, so there's an advantage there as well. But that's just keeping your carbohydrates topped up. And then after, try to take on some carbohydrates and some protein as soon as you can. Now, a lot of people talk about the anabolic window and it being a bit of a myth, but there is some truth to it. You know, you are more receptive to nutrients immediately after training. So make sure you're taking on carbohydrates, replenishing those glycogen stores, and taking on protein to kickstart that muscle recovery process as soon as possible. You know, failing to take on carbohydrates, I think it's in the first hour of training. I think I read this. I'll leave the study in the description down below, but if you fail to take on carbohydrates, I think it's within the first hour after training, you can hinder your recovery process by up to 30%. So it's really important to take on those carbohydrates, replenish those glycogen stores, kickstart that recovery process as soon as possible. And you can really load your carbohydrates around your training session, and then you might afford more fats later in the day. You know, we all like our healthy fats. They're, you know, satisfying, they're filling, they taste good. So if you're training in the morning, you might load your carbohydrates towards the front end of the day and have some more healthy fats later in the day. So you're aiming for that 60 to 80 grams later in the day, okay? You don't really want to be taking on fats around your training sessions. Reason being is that fats slow the digestive process, so they slow the absorption of the protein and the carbohydrates, which are really important for that, again, recovery process. So take on the carbohydrates and protein as a priority and save the fats for later. That would be my advice on that. Okay, moving on. What else have we got? To be fair, I think I've covered most of what I wanted to talk about. I have some sample meal structures here, some, you know, recipes and things to try. So I will allude to them, you know, slightly, talking about pre-workout snacks. So for me, I've already mentioned some, but a couple of rice cakes, banana, honey, maybe a little bit of peanut butter, just to make it taste a little bit better. You know, at the end of the day, we've got to enjoy what we're eating. That's the most important thing. What else have we got here? So on a rest day, increase in fats, you might have some more avocado. Rather than having 1 teaspoon of olive oil with your eggs, you might have a couple. You might, you know, have an olive oil dressing. You might throw some nuts into a salad. On a higher carbohydrate day, you might, rather than having 1 cup of white rice, you might have 1.5 cups of white rice. So it's not always necessary to increase the amount of meals that you're having. You might just add a little bit more to those meals. Now, snacks around training can be important. As I mentioned there, a pre-workout snack. Shakes can be a lifesaver. So a protein shake, so a real quality whey protein isolate supplement, or, you know, if you're vegan, a quality blend of vegan proteins, making sure that you're hitting all your amino acids, of course. Post-training, perhaps with, you know, a banana for the carbohydrates, some berries thrown in there, some frozen berries and some honey. That is an ideal post-workout snack. And then you can take that on straight away after your session, and then when you get home or when you get back from the gym, you can have a more substantial meal. So that substantial meal might look like eggs on toast or eggs and rice if it's a more intense training day. Remember, we're focusing on the protein and the carbohydrates as soon as possible. Okay, now that is pretty much all I wanted to cover today. I appreciate it's been a slightly longer one. We've just exceeded the 20-minute mark, I've noticed. So I'm going to wrap things up here. If you've got any questions, please do ask. I'm always happy to help. In the description down below, there is a link that will take you to a funnel for full transparency. If you're interested in learning a little bit more about this sort of stuff, or you want some more help, you know, actually incorporating this into your training regime, into your training routine, your rituals, go and check out the link. I'm always happy to help. Excuse me. I've got a little bit of a dodgy throat this morning. But other than that, that is it for this video. That is everything that you need to know, or the very foundations, the basics about how to split your macros for your performance and for your recovery. Again, it's important to consider that if you're not the most active of athletes, you're only training 2 or 3 times a week, you can still use the information here today to your advantage. So, you know, on those days you do train, you increase your carbohydrates, and you can keep things more stable on the other days. So you might match carbohydrates and fats more closely from a caloric, you know, intake perspective, noting that fats are more calorific than carbohydrates, of course. Okay, but those are the foundations. I'd really appreciate it if you could like, comment and subscribe, because I'm coming with so much content at the moment. I'm going to be uploading 3 times per week here on YouTube, providing so much value around, you know, how to fuel your training, how to fuel for health optimization, all these sorts of things. I take a holistic approach to health with, you know, nutrition really at the center of it. And I'm trying to help people like you, the everyday athlete, you know, improve their performance, get better, feel good about themselves. That's, you know, my main mission here. So I'd really appreciate it if you could like, comment and subscribe. Leave any feedback down in the description down below, any videos you want to see. I'll read all the comments, I reply to all the comments. So please be sure to go down there and let me know. But other than that, I wish you all the best day. Thank you so much for watching. If you've got to this point in the video, you're an absolute legend. I really do appreciate you. But yeah, have yourself a blessed day, and I will see you all in the next one in a bit.